If you're looking for a color film simulation recipe that you can use for any situation, look no further than Reggie's Portra. It has never failed me, and I'm very certain that it won't fail you. While this film simulation recipe started out as a way for me to replicate the look of film, after tweaking and testing it for over 2 years, I feel that it has evolved into the perfect balance of the film aesthetic and digital clarity. Before I walk you through all the settings for Reggie's Portra, I wanted to take a moment to thank today's video sponsor, Squarespace. I've actually been using Squarespace for over 10 years. Their templates and easy to use interface make it incredibly simple to create and maintain a professional looking website without any coding experience necessary. My Squarespace website was an essential part of how I built my photography business. It allows me to showcase my portfolio, share recent work on my blog, and receive inquiries from potential clients through my contact form. If you're one of those photographers relying on your Instagram profile as a sole place to share your work and build your photography business, I would really consider making a website on Squarespace. You can visit squarespace.com/Reggie to start a free trial and get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I'm going to walk you through the settings using the Fujifilm X100VI, which has the X-Trans4 sensor. And these are going to be the same settings if you use any camera that have the X-Trans4 or any of the newer cameras like the Fujifilm XT5, which has the X-Trans5 sensor. If you'd like to use this film simulation recipe on an older Fujifilm camera like the Fujifilm XT3, just use all the available settings that are there and just ignore the ones that are not available on your particular camera. So I start off my film simulation recipe having my image size set to large 3x2, and this is going to give me the largest JPEG possible, and I can always downsize from there. If I do want to shoot anything specific like an Instagram story or a YouTube thumbnail, I will change my aspect ratio to 16:9 in camera, or if I'm going to photograph something that's 1:1 like an Instagram post, I will also change it. And the main reason for this is so that I can actually preview the composition in camera. I will always still have the raw to be able to reapply the crop differently, but when it comes to photographing in a JPEG workflow, I like to make sure that I'm already working within the confines of the composition. And I'm going to set the image quality to fine plus raw. I don't actually use any of the raw files at all. This is more for the archival process or to be able to use Fuji X Studio to adapt and change the JPEG to a different setting later on. Typically, I only use the fine JPEG coming out, and the raw is just something extra that I never really look at after the fact. So for raw recording, I actually put this to lossless compress. For me, I don't think I need to maximize the quality by leaving it uncompressed. I would rather have a little bit more space and leave it in lossless compressed. The film simulation is probably the most crucial part that creates the look of Reggie's Portra, and for this I use classic chrome. Fujifilm says that this is a soft color and enhanced shadow contrast for a calm look, and that's really something that I really love about classic chrome. Off the bat, it does have kind of a blue tone to it, so that's something that we're going to massage as we create this film simulation recipe look. For grain effect, I actually turn this on and I leave it on weak and small. And the reason for this is I like to still have a little bit of a film aesthetic, and I feel that the grain structure within the Fujifilm camera is a little bit more organic and less kind of digitized. I don't really like the algorithm that Lightroom uses to add grain. For color chroma effect, I leave this on strong, and color chroma effect impacts kind of like the punch of the photo in the mid-tone contrast as well as the slight saturation bump, and this really lends itself to be awesome for those photos that are a little bit underexposed for sunsets or anything with bright direct sunlight. Next is color chroma effects blue, and I set this to weak. The main thing that you'll see with color chroma effect blue is that you'll see a shift in the skies from a more dark blue to more of a pastel teal, and this gives it that film-like aesthetic that you'll see in Kodak Portra or Lomography 400. The next important thing that we have is white balance, and I set mine to auto, but I have a few specific shifts that I tailor to my specific way that I photograph. So I set it to red 2, so over here, so we're going to move it over red 2, and blue -4. And the reason for this is I adjusted the recipe to utilize an auto white balance instead of a daytime balance. And I had to shift it in a way that was tuned for kind of like the melanated darker skin of my Filipino family. And this is something that's very specific to my personal work, but I feel that this gives a sense of warmth that isn't too orange, but at the same time is realistic to the skin tones of my family, which is pretty much 85% of the photos that I'm documenting. Feel free to tweak this as necessary, as I think this is where you can really personalize this film simulation. So next we have a dynamic range, and I leave this onto auto. And the main reason for this is I don't want to be locked into a higher ISO if I don't want to. I basically leave it on auto so that it can adjust the dynamic range as I'm shooting. And I have derange priority set to off. I don't really know what this specific setting does, but I just leave it on off. All right, so now the tone curve. I set the tone curve to -1 highlights, which is going to be a little bit of highlight saving. And then I'm going to use shadows -1, which gives a little bit of details in the shadows without being too much detail, so it doesn't look overly HDR-y. All right, so color is set to +2 because classic chrome actually is a little bit muted by default. And what I wanted to do was give a little bit of punch to it. So the color chrome effect as well as the color setting to +2 is really giving those types of saturation when it comes to sunsets or textures that have a lot of pop in it. And I have my sharpness to -2 because I don't really like my photos looking overly sharp, especially if I'm trying to replicate film a little bit. If I set it to 0 or even to the positive side, it's going to give a very crunchy look, which is something that I'm not looking for when it comes to my work, because I can always add a little bit of sharpness after the fact. Noise reduction. So noise reduction on Fujifilm cameras, I think everyone should by default always set this to -4. If you leave it on 0, that actually has a baseline level of noise reduction. So when you put it to -4, that's no noise reduction at all. And I find that the grain and the noise in the Fujifilm cameras, even at higher ISOs, is still very film-like rather than overly digital. So as long as you're exposing the photo correctly without relying it to be pushed up a little bit in post, you'll find that setting it to -4 is going to give you actually very good results. And you'll see in the Fujifilm X Weekly film simulation recipes, a lot of the clarities are set to negative in order to give a soft look. I actually set my clarity to 0, and there's a specific reason for this. When you actually set clarity to anything that's not 0, you'll notice that there's actually some sort of processing time. So if I put it to -3 and I take a photo, it's going to do this like storing thing where it's like trying to store the photo, and that only happens when you have the clarity set to something other than 0. So now if I put it back to 0 and I take another photo, it just shoots. And I set my clarity to 0 mainly because I don't want to have that delay when I'm photographing moments. I'm by trade a documentary wedding photographer, and I need to be able to keep photographing. And even though I'm trying to emulate the film-like workflow, I don't want this delay if there's something that needs to be photographed in a speedy fashion. So I set it to 0. And the way that I end up adding back kind of the softness and the halation to my photos is by using moment Cinebloom filters. I use at the very least a moment Cinebloom 5% diffusion filter at all times to add a little bit of touch of softness to get a little bit of halation in the highlights. I also have been recently using the Cinebloom 10% filter for a lot of things. What you'll notice though is when you're indoors in a backlit situation, there is going to be sometimes a lot of highlight blooming, which you're going to have to figure out how to control. The best way to control that is to shift your perspective. So like move a little bit to the left or the right in order to get that under control. And I also use a 20% strength, especially at nighttime, to give it dreamy effect to my photos. But I feel that a Cinebloom diffusion filter exposure at any strength is such a great investment if you're going after this film look without having to sacrifice the speed of the photographing frame rate of your camera. So next I have long exposure noise reduction to set to on, and I set my color space to sRGB, and the main reason for this is I transfer my photos over to my iPhone to post straight to stories or do a little bit of editing, and if I had it in Adobe RGB there would be a slight color shift from what I see on the camera over to my phone. And then here you can save this custom setting to your camera just right over here, and you can name it Portra or Reggie's Portrait or whatever you like. And with that, my name is Reggie Ballesteros. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you loved it, subscribe for more. Be sure to check out this video over here if you want to try out my go-to black and white film simulation recipe next.